Chapter 1: The First Fracture. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting familiar patterns on the walls of Alex's bedroom. He blinked away the remnants of sleep, reaching instinctively for his phone on the nightstand. 7:32 a.m. Same time as always. The comforting routine of a new day. But as he sat up, a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of déjà vu so intense that it momentarily made his head spin. He shook it off, chalking it up to the remnants of a vivid dream he couldn't quite recall. The day began like any other, with the same mundane tasks that usually grounded him: brushing his teeth, brewing coffee, checking emails. Yet, something felt off. The coffee tasted slightly different, the toothpaste was a bit more minty than usual, and the emails in his inbox, there was something eerily familiar about them. Too familiar. As Alex walked to the bus stop, the sensation only intensified. The same faces, the same conversations, the same car passing by at the exact same moment. It was as if he were watching a loop of the same scene replaying over and over again. The bus ride to work was no different. Alex found his usual seat by the window, but this time he noticed a small crack in the glass that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it caught his attention. The crack seemed out of place, like a fracture in the fabric of reality itself. He couldn't shake the feeling that the crack was important, though he had no idea why. As the day progressed, each moment became a slight variation of what he had already experienced. By noon, he was certain of it: he was trapped in some kind of loop, reliving the same day over and over, but with subtle, unsettling changes each time. Desperate for answers, Alex began to experiment. He changed his routine, took different routes, spoke to different people. But no matter what he did, the day always reset, dragging him back to that same morning with the same crack in the bus window. And each time, the crack grew larger. It wasn't until the sixth iteration that he noticed something truly alarming: his reflection in the bathroom mirror had started to change. The person staring back at him looked older, more worn, with lines of worry etched deeply into their face. And their eyes were filled with a fear that Alex hadn't yet fully realized. Each loop brought more fractures, more distortions. The world around him began to warp and twist in ways that defied logic. Buildings would stretch and contort as if made of rubber, time would stutter, repeating seconds in a disjointed sequence. People he knew would speak to him in languages he didn't understand, their faces shifting into unrecognizable forms. Alex tried to reach out for help, but every attempt was met with confusion or indifference. It was as if he was the only one aware of the disintegration of reality. Each night, he would fall asleep with a sense of dread, knowing that the next day would bring more chaos, more unraveling. On the seventh day, the loop began as usual, but something was different this time. The crack in the bus window had grown into a spider web of fractures, covering nearly the entire pane of glass. And as Alex stared at it, he saw something moving on the other side, something that wasn't there before. A shadowy figure, indistinct and formless, seemed to be watching him through the cracks. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized that whatever was on the other side of the fracture, it was aware of him. The barrier between worlds was thinning, and soon, whatever lay beyond that crack would break through. Chapter 2: Beyond the Fracture. The shadowy figure from the fractured window haunted Alex's thoughts. It was a presence that lingered at the edge of his consciousness, a constant reminder that something was deeply wrong. The following morning, the loop began again, but the changes were now undeniable. The sky had taken on a strange hue, a sickly green that made everything beneath it look unnatural. As Alex walked to the bus stop, he noticed that the familiar faces he had seen every day were now subtly distorted. Their eyes were too wide, their smiles too sharp, as if they were wearing masks that didn't quite fit. Conversations around him were a jumble of words that made no sense, a cacophony of sound that left him disoriented. When the bus arrived, Alex hesitated before boarding. The crack in the window had grown even larger, and through it, he could see more shadows shifting and writhing on the other side. The bus driver, normally a quiet man in his late 50s, turned to Alex with a grin that was too wide, too full of teeth. "You don't want to be late, now, do you?" the driver said, his voice dripping with something that sounded like mockery. Alex forced himself to board, knowing that avoiding the bus wouldn't change anything. The ride was eerily silent, except for the faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the growing crack in the window. The other passengers sat unnaturally still, their heads turned slightly toward Alex as if they were waiting for something. When the bus finally reached his stop, Alex practically bolted out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The familiar streets of his neighborhood were now unrecognizable, twisted and warped as if seen through a funhouse mirror. Buildings loomed at impossible angles, their windows dark and empty. The sky above churned with clouds that moved too fast, creating an unsettling sense of vertigo. Alex knew he couldn't continue like this. The loops were becoming more chaotic, the fractures in reality more severe. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and he was at the center of it. Determined to find answers, Alex made his way to the only place he could think of that might hold some clues, the library. It was an old, imposing structure that had always seemed a little out of place in their modern city, but now it felt like the only stable thing left in his world. The interior of the library was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Alex quickly navigated the labyrinth of shelves, searching for anything that might explain the fractures. His eyes scanned the titles of books, old and new, until one in particular caught his attention. The book was ancient, its cover worn and faded, but the title was clear, The Veil Between Worlds. Alex pulled it from the shelf and flipped through the brittle pages, his heart racing as he read about parallel dimensions, time loops, and fractures in reality. The book described how certain events or anomalies could cause a tear in the fabric of space-time, allowing different realities to bleed into one another. The cracks, like the one in the bus window, were gateways, thin spots in the veil that separated one world from the next. As Alex read, he felt the temperature in the library drop. The shadows around him seemed to grow longer, darker. He looked up from the book and saw that the library was no longer empty. Figures stood in the aisles between the shelves, their faces obscured by darkness. They were watching him. His breath caught in his throat as one of the figures stepped forward, its features slowly becoming clear. It was him, an older, haggard version of himself, with hollow eyes and deep lines etched into his face. The other Alex stared at him with a mix of pity and warning. "You've seen the cracks," the older Alex said, his voice a raspy echo. "You know what's coming. But you haven't seen the worst of it yet." Before Alex could respond, the older version of himself began to dissolve, the shadows consuming him until there was nothing left but darkness. The temperature dropped further, and Alex could see his breath misting in the cold air. The book in his hands began to glow faintly, the pages turning on their own as if guided by an unseen force. The words on the pages rearranged themselves, forming a single, ominous sentence: "The fracture is only the beginning." The library began to shake, the walls cracking as if under immense pressure. Alex clutched the book to his chest and ran, but no matter how fast he moved, the exits seemed to slip further away. The world around him was coming apart, and he was running out of time. Chapter 3: Shattered Perception. Alex burst out of the library, gasping for air as if he had just escaped a nightmare. The cold wind bit at his skin, but the chill that ran through him came from a deeper, more primal fear. The world outside was even worse than before, twisted, distorted, as though reality itself was beginning to unravel. The streets were empty, the buildings looming overhead like dark, misshapen giants. The sky was a swirling mass of sickly green and black clouds, churning in unnatural patterns. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. Clutching the ancient book, The Veil Between Worlds, Alex knew he had to find a way to stop the fractures from spreading. But how? The book had offered only cryptic warnings and half-explanations. He needed more. He needed to understand the source of the fractures and how to seal them before it was too late. As he walked, the ground began to ripple, waves of energy distorting the concrete as though it were water. Alex stumbled, his vision blurring as the world around him warped and twisted. He closed his eyes, trying to regain his balance, but when he opened them again, he found himself standing in a completely different place. It was his childhood home. The familiar warmth of the living room enveloped him, a stark contrast to the cold, fractured world he had just left behind. The room was exactly as he remembered it, down to the smallest detail. The worn sofa, the faded rug, the family photos on the mantelpiece. It was as if he had stepped back in time. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. The house felt empty, hollow, as if it were just a replica of the real thing. Alex walked slowly through the rooms, his heart pounding in his chest. Memories flooded back, happy times with his parents, long-forgotten moments of laughter and love. Then he saw them. His parents sat at the dining table, their backs to him. They were still, too still, like mannequins frozen in place. Alex felt a surge of hope, mixed with fear. He hadn't seen his parents in years, not since the accident. Could this be real? Could they really be here? Mom? Dad? His voice trembled as he spoke, the words echoing in the silence. They didn't respond. Slowly, Alex moved closer, his breath catching in his throat. As he reached out to touch his mother's shoulder, she turned to face him. But the moment their eyes met, he realized his terrible mistake. It wasn't his mother. The face staring back at him was a twisted, grotesque version of her, eyes sunken and hollow, skin pale and lifeless. A cruel, distorted smile spread across her lips, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Alex, she hissed, her voice a chilling mockery of his mother's. You shouldn't have come here. The figure lunged at him, and Alex stumbled back in horror, falling to the floor. As he scrambled to his feet, the walls of the house began to crack and splinter, dark shadows seeping through the fractures. The entire structure seemed to be crumbling around him, the twisted version of his parents closing in. With no time to think, Alex ran. The house disintegrated behind him, walls collapsing and floors giving way. The shadows reached out like tendrils, trying to drag him into the void. He could hear his mother's laughter, a haunting, hollow sound that echoed in his mind. He burst through the front door, expecting to be back on the street, but instead, he found himself in another place entirely. The world around him was a kaleidoscope of distorted images, a mishmash of memories and places that shouldn't coexist. He saw his childhood bedroom merging with his high school hallway, the park where he used to play overlapping with his old office. Time and space had become meaningless, blending together in a chaotic swirl. The fracture was growing, tearing through the fabric of reality itself. Alex could feel it now, a pulsing energy that resonated deep within him, as if he were somehow connected to the very thing that was destroying his world. Amidst the chaos, he saw the figure again, the shadowy presence from the bus window, now clearer than ever. It stood at the center of the storm, its form shifting and changing, but its gaze fixed on Alex. There was a sense of recognition, as if the figure knew him, understood him in a way that no one else ever could. You can't escape, the figure's voice echoed in Alex's mind, a whisper that carried the weight of inevitability. This is only the beginning. Alex's surroundings began to blur and twist once more, the fracture spreading faster now. He knew he had to find the source of the fracture, the origin of this chaos. But how could he fight something that was tearing apart the very fabric of reality? With renewed determination, Alex clutched the book tighter and set off into the unknown, determined to find answers before it was too late. Chapter 4: The Convergence. The vortex in the square continued to expand, its gravitational pull growing stronger with each passing second. Alex stood on the edge of the chaos, his mind reeling from the sight beyond the fracture. Through the swirling void, he could see glimpses of another world, a place that both fascinated and terrified him. The world on the other side of the fracture was not like his own. It was a twisted reflection, a mirror image distorted by some unseen force. The buildings were familiar yet alien, their architecture impossible and unnatural. The sky above was a deep crimson, streaked with black clouds that churned like a living entity. The people, too, were different, shadowy figures that moved with an unnatural grace, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. As Alex stared into this parallel reality, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The fracture wasn't just a window, it was a doorway. And whatever lay beyond it was trying to break through. A sudden surge of energy emanated from the vortex, sending shock waves through the ground. Alex stumbled back, barely keeping his footing as the world around him continued to unravel. He watched in horror as the vortex began to pull more than just debris into its maw. The shadowy figures from the other side were emerging, stepping through the fracture and into his world. The first figure to cross the threshold was tall and gaunt, its movements fluid and deliberate. It surveyed the scene with an air of cold detachment, as if it were assessing its new surroundings. Behind it, More figures followed, each one more terrifying than the last. They moved with a purpose, their eyes, if they had eyes, locked onto Alex. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think, had to act. The book. The ancient tome he had found in the library, it had to hold the key to stopping this madness. Frantically, Alex flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might help him close the fracture. The words on the pages seemed to shift and change as he read, the text morphing into languages he didn't understand. But then, just as he was about to lose hope, the words settled into something he could comprehend. The convergence is inevitable. The only way to close the fracture is to seal it from within. The meaning of the words hit him like a cold wave. If he wanted to stop the vortex, he would have to enter it, cross into the parallel world and seal the fracture from the other side. It was a suicide mission, but what choice did he have? If he did nothing, both worlds would be consumed by the growing chaos. Determined, Alex closed the book and steeled himself for what was to come. The shadowy figures were getting closer, their presence sending chills down his spine. He could feel their malevolent intent, a hunger for destruction that threatened to overwhelm him. With a deep breath, Alex took a step toward the vortex. The pull of the fracture was almost unbearable, dragging him forward with an invisible force. The closer he got, the more the world around him seemed to dissolve, the edges of reality blurring into a kaleidoscope of light and darkness. Just as he was about to be consumed by the vortex, a voice echoed in his mind, his own voice, but distorted, as if speaking from a great distance. This is your only chance. Seal the fracture, or all will be lost. With that final push, Alex leaped into the vortex, the world around him dissolving into chaos as he was pulled into the parallel reality. Chapter 5, The Final Fracture. Alex was swallowed by the vortex, his body tumbling through a maelstrom of light and shadow. He felt as though he were being torn apart, every cell in his body stretched to the breaking point. Then, with a jarring thud, he landed on solid ground. He was in the other world now, the parallel reality he had glimpsed through the fracture. The sky above was an oppressive red, swirling with storm clouds that crackled with dark energy. The buildings around him, twisted and alien, loomed like ancient monoliths from a forgotten era. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very atmosphere were alive and watching him. The shadowy figures that had crossed into his world were here, too, but they paid him no mind. Instead, they moved toward the heart of this strange city, converging on a massive structure that pulsed with the same energy as the vortex. It was clear to Alex that this was the source of the fractures, the place where the fabric of reality was weakest. The structure was a towering spire of black stone, its surface covered in glowing symbols that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. At the top of the spire, a swirling mass of darkness and light, the heart of the fracture, pulsed with a malevolent energy, feeding off the chaos it had created. Alex knew what he had to do. The book's cryptic message echoed in his mind, seal the fracture from within. He had to reach the top of the spire and find a way to close the tear before it consumed both worlds. As he approached the spire, the ground beneath him began to shake. The city itself seemed to resist his presence, the buildings warping and shifting to block his path. But Alex pressed on, his determination stronger than ever. He had come too far to turn back now. The climb was arduous, each step a battle against the forces trying to stop him. The spire's surface was slick and treacherous, the glowing symbols burning his hands as he pulled himself up. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and the darkness around him deepened, pressing in on him from all sides. When he finally reached the top, Alex found himself standing before the heart of the fracture. It was a swirling void of energy, a gaping wound in the fabric of reality that threatened to tear everything apart. The shadowy figures were here, too, gathered around the void like worshippers at an altar. They turned to him as one, their eyes empty voids of darkness boring into his soul. "You cannot stop what has already begun," one of the figures intoned, its voice a hollow echo. "The convergence of worlds is inevitable. You are too late." But Alex refused to believe that. Clutching the ancient book, he stepped forward, the pages glowing with an intense light. The words on the page shifted once more, forming a new incantation, a way to seal the fracture and restore balance. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Alex began to chant the words, his voice rising above the cacophony of the storm around him. The void reacted violently, thrashing and pulsating as if in pain. The shadowy figures recoiled, their forms distorting as the light from the book grew brighter. With one final shout, Alex completed the incantation, thrusting the book into the heart of the fracture. The void shrieked, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of his mind. For a moment, everything went still. Then, with a deafening roar, the fracture began to collapse in on itself. The spire shook violently, the ground beneath Alex crumbling as the void imploded. The shadowy figures were sucked into the collapsing fracture, their screams echoing in the darkness. The light from the book flared one last time, and then, nothing. When Alex opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground, back in his own world. The sky above was clear and blue, the city around him whole and undisturbed. There was no sign of the fractures, no trace of the parallel world he had just escaped from. It was over. He slowly rose to his feet, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The ancient book was gone, consumed by the void, but the world was safe. The fractures had been sealed, and the convergence had been stopped. But as Alex looked around, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world seemed different. Subtle, almost imperceptible changes, like the taste of the air or the way the shadows fell. He couldn't be sure if it was real, or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him after everything he had been through. As he walked home, Alex couldn't help but glance at the reflection in a nearby window. For a brief moment, he saw not his own reflection, but the shadowy figure that had haunted him. It stared back at him with those same empty voids for eyes, a silent reminder that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. But when he blinked, the image was gone, leaving only his own reflection staring back at him. Shaking his head, Alex continued on, determined to reclaim the life he had fought so hard to save. Yet deep down, he knew that the scars of the fracture would never fully heal. And as he walked through the familiar streets, a single, haunting thought echoed in his mind. What if the fracture was just the beginning?